Order. Sorry, Prime Minister. We are elected members of Parliament. All ministers serve this House, not Sky News or the BBC. So I do hope the message is going back. The ministerial code is not fit for purpose if this continues to happen. So I hope it's going to be used and make sure that ministers take it seriously. So please, as I stated yesterday, matters relating to defence of the realm should always come to this House first.
Nigel Farage just delivered the most brutal takedown of Keir Starmer that Westminster has witnessed in decades. This happened live during Prime Minister's questions, broadcast to millions. And what Farage did was nothing short of a political execution. Starmer walked into the chamber thinking he could handle whatever questions came his way. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. Farage stood up with a question so perfectly crafted, so devastatingly precise that Starmer's face went pale. You could see the panic in his eyes as he realised he'd been trapped. And then Farage twisted the knife. He didn't shout. He didn't rant. He simply laid out facts that Starmer couldn't deny, asked questions Starmer couldn't answer, and exposed contradictions that made the Prime Minister look like an amateur who'd stumbled into a job he wasn't qualified for. The chamber erupted. MPS on all sides were stunned by what they'd just witnessed. And Starmer, the man who's supposed to be in control, who's supposed to have all the answers, could only stammer and deflect and desperately try to change the subject. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the footage of this humiliation is already going viral, destroying what's left of Starmer's credibility. Let's start with exactly what Nigel Farage said, because the precision of his attack is what made it so devastating. Farage has been in Parliament for months now, and he's been relatively quiet during PMQs, asking occasional questions, but nothing that really landed. Today was different. Today, Farage came prepared with research, with receipts, with a strategy designed to maximise Starmer's embarrassment. He stood up and began by referencing a promise Starmer made during the election campaign. Specifically, Starmer had pledged that Labour would not raise taxes on working people. He'd said it repeatedly, emphatically, making it a central part of his pitch to voters. Farage quoted Starmer's exact words back to him, the video clips that everyone remembers, the promises that seemed so definitive at the time. Then Farage moved to the present day. He listed one by one the taxes that Labour has raised since taking office. National insurance contributions for employers, which economists universally agree gets passed on to workers through lower wages. Fuel duty, which hits working people hardest because they're the ones commuting to jobs. Council tax increases that local authorities are implementing because of reduced central government funding. Farage went through each one methodically, citing the figures, explaining how each tax increase directly contradicts Starmer's promise. And with each item on the list, you could see Starmer sinking lower in his seat, realising that he had no good answer to what was coming. But Farage wasn't done. He then pulled out the masterstroke. He asked Starmer to define what he means by working people, because Starmer's defence of his tax increases has been that they don't affect working people, only the wealthy and corporations. But as Farage pointed out, employers are working people, small business owners are working people, drivers paying fuel duty are working people. So who exactly is excluded from Starmer's definition of working people? Is it only salaried employees? Does it exclude anyone who owns a business, no matter how small? Does it exclude anyone with savings or investments? The question was brilliant because there's no good answer. If Starmer defines working people narrowly, he admits his promise covered fewer people than voters assumed. If he defines it broadly, he admits he's broken his promise by raising taxes that affect those people. Starmer's response was painful to watch. He started by trying to claim that employer national insurance doesn't count as a tax on working people because it's paid by businesses, not individuals. The moment those words left his mouth, you could hear the groans from economists and anyone with basic understanding of how tax incidence works. Businesses don't absorb tax increases out of the goodness of their hearts. They pass costs on through lower wages, higher prices, or reduced hiring. Starmer was essentially arguing that economic reality doesn't apply to his government's policies. It was the kind of answer that sounds superficially clever but falls apart under any scrutiny. And Farage, grinning like a cat that's caught a particularly slow mouse, immediately pounced on it. Farage responded with barely concealed contempt. He cited multiple economic studies showing that employer taxes reduce worker wages. He quoted the Office for Budget Responsibility, the government's own forecaster, which had published analysis showing exactly this effect from Labour's tax increases. He mentioned that even Labour-supporting economists had admitted that these taxes would hurt workers. And then he asked the killer follow-up question, does the Prime Minister really expect the British people to believe that raising taxes on their employers won't affect their jobs, their wages or their opportunities? Or is he simply hoping we're all stupid enough to accept his word games while our pay packets shrink? The chamber erupted. Conservative MPs are banging their desks and shouting agreement. Reform UK members were on their feet applauding Farage. Even some Labour backbench chairs looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with their leader. The Speaker had to call for order, but the damage to Starmer was visible and irreversible. He'd been exposed as either economically illiterate or deliberately misleading, and neither option is good for a Prime Minister. His face was red, his jaw clenched, and when he stood to respond again, his voice had an edge of anger that suggested Farage had really gotten under his skin. Starmer's second response was even worse than his first. Instead of addressing the substance of Farage's question, he attacked Farage personally. He brought up Farage's past statements, his political history, his associations. He suggested that Farage was only asking these questions to score political points rather than out of genuine concern for working people. It was classic deflection, the kind of response politicians use when they don't have a good answer to the actual question. And everyone in that chamber knew it. When you resort to attacking the questioner rather than answering the question, you've already lost the argument. Farage had trapped Starmer in a contradiction that couldn't be explained away, and Starmer's only response was to try changing the subject. But Farage wasn't letting him off that easily. Parliamentary rules only allow one supplementary question, but Farage had done something clever. He'd coordinated with other Reform UK MPs who then stood up in sequence to ask related questions that kept hammering the same point. Each question referenced specific tax increases, specific broken promises, specific groups of working people being hurt by Labour's policies. It was a coordinated assault that kept Starmer on the defensive for nearly 10 minutes, unable to escape the topic, forced to repeatedly defend the indefensible. And with each attempt to defend his record, Starmer made things worse, so as providing more clips that would be used against him in attack ads and social media posts. The political commentators watching this unfold in real time immediately recognised the significance. This wasn't just a bad day at PMQs. This was a defining moment that would reshape the narrative around Starmer's government. The promise not to raise taxes on working people had been central to Labour's election pitch. It was how Starmer convinced swing voters to trust him despite their reservations. And Farage had just demolished that promise on live television, using Starmer's own words and the government's own policies. There's no coming back from that. The betrayal is too clear, the contradiction too obvious, the evidence too overwhelming. The immediate aftermath in the chamber was extraordinary. After PMQs ended and MPs filed out, the usual partisan divisions seemed less important than the shared recognition that something significant had just happened. Conservative MPs were jubilant, recognising that Farage had handed them ammunition they'd be using for months. Reform UK members were energised, believing this moment proved they're the real opposition to Labour, not the weakened Tories. Even Liberal Democrat MPs, usually focused on their own priorities, were discussing how effectively Farage had exposed Starmer's vulnerabilities. And Labour MPs looked shell-shocked, knowing that the video clips from this exchange would dominate news coverage and social media for days. The media reaction was swift and brutal. Within minutes, news outlets were running headlines like "Farage destroys Starmer over broken tax promise" and "PM left speechless by reform leaders questioning." Political editors were calling it the most effective opposition performance in recent parliamentary history. The BBC's political correspondent noted that Starmer had faced tough questions before, but this was different because Farage had him caught in an indefensible position with nowhere to hide. Sky News ran a fact-check segment that concluded Farage's claims about Labour's tax increases were accurate and Starmer's defences were misleading at best. Even outlets that typically support Labour struggled to spin this in Starmer's favour. Social media exploded with reaction. The video of Farage's questioning hit millions of views within hours. Twitter was flooded with clips, memes and commentary, almost all of it negative for Starmer. The hashtag #StarmerLies trended alongside Farage and broken promises. Conservative and Reform UK social media teams were amplifying the content, ensuring maximum reach, but they barely needed to because ordinary voters were sharing it themselves, expressing anger at being lied to and satisfaction at seeing Starmer held accountable. The viral nature of this moment means that even people who don't normally follow politics are seeing Starmer's humiliation, spreading awareness of Labour's broken promises far beyond the usual politically engaged audience. The economic argument Farage made is resonating because people are feeling it in their daily lives. Working families have noticed that their tax burden has increased under Labour despite Starmer's promises. Small business owners are struggling with higher costs that they can't pass on without losing customers. The disconnect between what Starmer promised and what he's delivered is stark, and Farage articulated that disconnect in a way that cut through the usual political noise. He didn't get bogged down in technical details or parliamentary procedure. He spoke in plain language about broken promises and real consequences, which is exactly what voters respond to. Political analysts are already discussing the long-term implications of this exchange. Farage has established himself as the most effective critic of Starmer's government, surpassing even the leader of the opposition in impact. That's partly because Farage doesn't carry the baggage of the Conservative Party's own record in government. He can attack Labour's broken promises without being defensive about Tory failures, and his style, more direct and confrontational than traditional parliamentary debate, resonates with voters who are tired of polite evasion and want politicians who speak plainly. Today's performance will be studied as a masterclass in opposition tactics, showing how preparation, timing and rhetorical skill can completely dismantle a Prime Minister's defences. The damage to Starmer's credibility is immense and possibly irreversible. Trust is the foundation of political leadership, and Starmer's already fragile trust with voters has taken a massive hit. Polling companies are scrambling to conduct surveys measuring public reaction, but early indicators suggest a significant drop in Starmer's approval ratings and Labour's support. More importantly, this exchange has reinforced narratives about Starmer that were already circulating: that he's dishonest, that he'll say anything to get elected, that his promises mean nothing once he's in power. These narratives are now backed by concrete evidence that millions of people have seen with their own eyes. Labour's response strategy is in chaos. Downing Street initially tried to argue that Starmer had actually answered Farage's questions effectively and that media coverage was biased. That approach was laughably disconnected from reality and was quickly abandoned when even Labour-supporting commentators pointed out how badly the exchange had gone for Starmer. The revised strategy seems to be attacking Farage's credibility and motives, suggesting he's only interested in causing chaos rather than constructive politics. But this approach has problems too, because it doesn't address the substance of what Farage said. You can attack the messenger all you want, but if the message is accurate and resonates with voters, the attack falls flat. Behind closed doors, Labour MPs are furious. They're angry that Starmer made such a specific promise about taxes when advisers must have known it would be difficult to keep. They're frustrated that he didn't have better answers prepared for obvious questions about tax increases. And they're terrified about what this means for their electoral prospects. Many Labour MPs won seats with small majorities, and they're now facing constituents who feel betrayed by broken promises on taxes. Those MPs are going to have to defend Starmer's record on doorsteps, in town halls and in local media interviews. And after today's humiliation, that defence just got exponentially harder. The Conservative Party is capitalising on this moment, but they're also worried. Worried because it wasn't their leader who delivered this blow to Starmer. It was Farage. The Tories are supposed to be the main opposition party, but Reform UK just demonstrated more effective opposition in 10 minutes than the Conservatives have managed in months. This raises uncomfortable questions for Conservative leadership about their strategy, their effectiveness and their relevance if voters looking for an alternative to Labour are more impressed by Farage than by the Conservative leader. That's an existential threat to the Tory party's future. The broader political landscape is shifting in response to this moment. Reform UK stock is rising dramatically. Their membership is surging. Their polling numbers are climbing. Donors who were sceptical about backing a relatively new party are reconsidering, impressed by Farage's performance and the media attention it generated. Reform has struggled to be taken seriously as more than a protest movement, but moments like this establish credibility. When Farage can go toe-to-toe with the Prime Minister and win decisively, it signals that Reform is a legitimate political force that can't be dismissed or ignored. The impact on upcoming elections and by-elections is significant. Labour was already facing challenges in local elections, but this scandal makes their prospects much worse. Conservative and Reform candidates now have a simple, devastating message. Labour promised not to raise your taxes and then raised your taxes. They lied to you. Vote for us instead. It's direct, it's fact-based, and it's difficult for Labour to counter. Every Labour candidate is going to be asked about Starmer's broken promises, and there's no good answer they can give that will satisfy angry voters who feel betrayed. International observers are watching with interest as well. Foreign governments are assessing whether Starmer's weakened position affects Britain's reliability as a partner. Investors are questioning whether Labour's economic policies are coherent or whether they're making things up as they go along. Britain's reputation for stable, competent governance is taking a hit, and that has real-world consequences for trade negotiations, diplomatic influence, and economic confidence. When your Prime Minister gets humiliated in Parliament over basic questions about his economic policies, it doesn't inspire confidence in your country's leadership. The institutional damage extends beyond immediate political considerations. Parliament's credibility depends on Prime Ministers being held accountable for their promises and policies. Today's exchange showed that accountability working exactly as it should. A Prime Minister made promises, broke them, and was confronted with evidence of that betrayal in a public forum where he couldn't escape or evade. That's democratic accountability in action. But the fact that it took Nigel Farage rather than the official opposition to deliver this accountability raises questions about whether traditional political parties are still capable of performing their basic functions. Looking ahead, Starmer faces impossible choices. He can't reverse the tax increases without creating massive holes in his budget and admitting his entire economic strategy was wrong. But he can't defend the tax increases without continuing to look dishonest about his pre-election promises. He can't attack Farage's credibility effectively because Farage's claims are factually accurate. And he can't change the subject because this issue touches on fundamental questions of trust and honesty that voters care deeply about. He's trapped in a political box with no clean exit, and every day he remains trapped, more damage accumulates. The personal toll on Starmer is also becoming evident. Sources close to the Prime Minister describe him as furious and humiliated by today's events. He reportedly feels that Farage's tactics were unfair, that the media coverage is biased, that he's being held to standards that other politicians aren't. But feeling victimised doesn't change political reality. The reality is that Starmer made specific promises, broke those promises, and got caught. The reality is that his defences when confronted were inadequate and made him look worse, and the reality is that millions of people watched him get humiliated by Nigel Farage, and that's not something that can be spun away or forgotten. Party strategists are already gaming out scenarios for replacing Starmer. If his position becomes untenable, who could take over? Who has the credibility to restore trust? Who could reset Labour's relationship with voters? These are difficult questions because Labour's bench isn't particularly deep, and anyone who served in Starmer's cabinet would carry the taint of his broken promises. A leadership contest would be messy and divisive. potentially making Labour's problems worse before they get better. But if Starmer continues to be a liability, if every appearance becomes another opportunity for humiliation, the party may decide that short-term chaos is preferable to long-term decline. The precedent this sets is significant. Future Prime Ministers will remember that making overly specific promises about taxes is dangerous, because those promises can be weaponised against you when circumstances force you to break them. Political consultants will cite this exchange as a case study in how not to handle accountability moments, and opposition politicians will study Farage's technique, learning how to trap government ministers with their own words and past commitments. Parliamentary politics has always involved holding leaders to their promises, but what Farage did today was a master class in execution that will influence how opposition politics is conducted for years to come. The public's response is perhaps most telling. Ordinary voters, not political junkies, but regular people who occasionally tune into politics, are talking about this. They're sharing the clips, discussing the broken promises, expressing anger and disappointment. That widespread engagement suggests this moment has broken through in a way that most parliamentary exchanges don't. It's become part of the national conversation, part of how people understand Starmer and his government. And once a negative perception embeds itself in the public consciousness, it's extraordinarily difficult to shift. The media cycle over the coming days will be crucial. If this story maintains momentum, if new revelations emerge about other broken promises or policy failures, Starmer could face a sustained crisis that permanently damages his premiership. Newsrooms are already assigning reporters to dig deeper into Labour's tax policies, looking for other discrepancies between promises and reality. Opposition research teams are combing through Starmer's past statements, searching for more ammunition. The feeding frenzy has begun, and it won't stop until either the story runs out of steam or Starmer is forced from office. What happened today at PMQs was more than a bad day for Keir Starmer. It was a political humiliation that exposed fundamental flaws in his leadership and honesty. Nigel Farage didn't just win a debate, he systematically dismantled Starmer's credibility on one of the most important issues in politics, whether voters can trust what politicians tell them. The answer, based on today's evidence, is that they cannot trust Keir Starmer. He made promises he didn't keep. He raised taxes he said he wouldn't raise. And when confronted with evidence of his betrayal, he had no adequate defence. This moment will define his premiership, possibly end it, and certainly ensure that trust in his word has been destroyed beyond repair. Farage walked into that chamber prepared to expose a liar, and that's exactly what he did. The consequences are only just beginning.